Well, hello there, all my diecast fanatics. How you doing today? I hope that you are all doing well, staying healthy, enjoying life. All right, so today, this video, I'm going to entitle this video Automotive Oddities, okay? Why are these cars considered oddities? Well, for any number of reasons. It could be because of their styling, because of a particular package that's offered on them. It could be because of the engineering or equipment that's on them. Any number of reasons, okay? So we got multiple manufacturers up here. We have Greenlight, Auto World, Johnny Lightning, and I think that's actually all of them. That's all the different manufacturers we got up here. And cars from all different makes here as well. So we say we dive right into this, okay? All right, so spinning on the turntable here, we've got a 1963 Dodge 330, okay? What makes this so odd? Well, for one thing, starting in 1961, Dodge and Plymouth decided to restyle and also downsize their full-size cars, which was very strange. When all the other car makers were making their cars longer, lower, wider, which was like the Detroit mantra, Dodge decided and Plymouth decided to take a different tact, and it was not very successful. These cars ended up being among the most slowest selling and also kind of considered some of the ugliest cars ever made. One thing about the Dodge 330, this one does not have that particular power plant that I'm going to mention, but you could get something called a 426 max wedge in this bad boy. Okay, not a Hemi, but it was a 426 max wedge it was called, and that was very powerful, was very popular in the drag strip. But if you look at the front end of this car, this is why it was kind of weird. You know, you got these low beam and high beam headlamps, and they're not in line with each other. They're not even different. They're not even the same size. So it's a very odd design. You know, from this angle, it's not too bad looking. You could almost pass it off as handsome, but still, it was just very weird, the styling of these cars. I think one of the most oddball ones was probably the 61 Valiant. That car probably has gone down in history as just one of the ugliest Chrysler products that was ever produced. I think even the AMC Gremlin was better looking than that one. Goodness. But yeah, when you optioned it up right, the Dodge 330 was quite a potent performer. And this one is casting by Auto World. It's finished in this very delightful kind of a frost green with a, looks like it's a black interior, which I actually really hate. It's like, come on guys, why not just give it a green interior, something that gives it some pop, you know? That'd be a lot nicer. But still, interesting automotive specimen there. All right, let's move on here. Let's take a look at some international scouts, shall we? Now, the first scout I'm going to show you is definitely an oddball for a couple reasons. Now, this is a 1961. This is a Greenlight casting. My father had the 1965 version of this car, and his affectionate term for it was the Nutmobile. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it was powered by a four-cylinder engine that was like half of a V8. It literally was sitting in there at like a slant. You could almost call it a slant 4, as opposed to Dodge's slant 6. But it was like half of a V8. And I think there was an optional 6-cylinder and also an optional actual V8, which I believe was, I want to say 304 cubic inches, but I might be wrong about that, because that was actually an AMC engine. But this Scout also had vacuum actuated windshield wipers that were hinged above the windshield. And when you would actuate these wipers, because they're vacuum actuated, they would kind of run independently of each other, and they changed with your throttle inputs how fast they went. And they only had one speed. You couldn't make them go faster or slower naturally, but you know, by turning a dial or anything like that. It was all relying on engine vacuum, and they were just crazy to look at. And my father had a very hilarious imitation he used to do of them. So yeah, that's what makes this International Scout kind of a oddball vehicle, because of those two things. This top was removable. You could take it off. And I saw one of these one time without a top, and it looked to me just like a road-going bathtub, because that's, to me, what these trucks looked like back then. But you know what? It's a kind of a handsome little sport utility vehicle back before they were even called that. Nice shade of green. This one's got white wall tires, which would have been unusual for an off-road vehicle. But believe it or not, that was an option. That's the International Harvester symbol right there. Yeah, I mean, my dad's 65 looked just like this. It had these same little, character lines on the hood, the same shape to the door. Oh, by the way, the doors were removable. I remember they had fabric catches on them to keep them from going open all the way, and you could remove the doors, and then it really looked weird when you did that. And I remember his had a spare tire mounted to the back there. His had the same round tail lamps. All right. Now, the next Scout I'm going to show you. Now, this is called the Scout 2. I'm going to bring them both up here. So, by this point in time, they weren't quite so weird. They were a lot more modern. They had electronic ignition. They had electric wipers. And a lot of other modern conveniences you would expect in what was, a modern car. But what makes this one weird is this one here. Okay, this is called a Midas package. I did not even know that this package existed. I don't even remember what year it came out. I want to say 1979 because I think both of these are actually 1979 Scout 2s. And these had what's called a 345 V8. That was what International used in the Scout. So this has got this special stripe package on it. You got those little his and hers sunroofs on there. Special wheels. And yeah, just a very interesting package on the Scout 2. And by the way, these were very capable vehicles. And it's interesting too because they didn't sit particularly high. But the way they were engineered, they actually had quite a bit of ground clearance. And they were really a, go anywhere, do anything kind of vehicle. Especially when you equip them with that strong 345 V8. Because even by 1970 standards, it was quite potent. All right, and this is the normal version. There was a lot of International Scouts back in the days that looked like this. There was also a special extended wheelbase Scout that had a kind of a slanted back to it. I don't remember the name of that one. And then International also had something that was similar to a Suburban called a Travel All. All right, here's another weird one. Now, the Chevy Monza was actually a very popular car in the 1970s. What makes this one weird is it's got an interesting little package called a Spider package. There were very precious few of these sold because most people who bought a Monza two-door just wanted something that was an economical transportation that happened to also look a little bit sporty. Interestingly enough, in the Monza, you could get the base engine was like the 2.5 liter Iron Duke engine, which was one of the most roughest, crudest, unrefined hunk of junk power plants ever conceived. You also could get a Buick 3.8 liter V6, which was fairly new at that time. And then you could also get Chevy's 305 V8. In fact, I think that's the way Spiders came equipped, was with the 305 two-barrel V8. So you can imagine, even with a 305 two-barrel V8 in that lightweight car, it would scoot pretty good for 1970s specifications, being smogged out and everything. But the Monza coupe was very stiletto styled, I guess is the word for it. And when you added the Spider package, you got this nice little spoiler on the back. You got the little air dam, the very special stripe package. And that was what this one would have had. It makes it kind of an odd one. I don't even think I've ever seen a Monza with the Spider package in my entire existence. And I grew up when these cars were new. I remember they were everywhere at one point. I even had a little plastic one I used to play with over at my grandpa's house. But they're kind of a cool looking little car. And believe it or not, they used Vega architecture as their underpinnings. They were a much better built car than the Vega, that's for sure. Much more popular too. And there was also like a two-door notchback that looked like a little miniature luxury car if you optioned it upright. All right, here's another one that's an oddball because of its package. Oh, and by the way, the Monza Spider, that was a Johnny Lightning casting, as is this. So here's the thing. Plymouth kept the Roadrunner alive. Initially, the Roadrunner package, you remember that from 1968. It was his own model through 1974. Then it became like a trim package on the Fury. And then after that, starting around 1977, they started making it a special trim package on their Volare. So what you have here is a Volare Roadrunner. These are exceedingly rare. I think I've seen exactly one in my lifetime. And believe me, this is yet another car that when I was a kid growing up, Plymouth Velaris and Dodge Aspens were everywhere. In fact, my grandpa Powell had a four-door Plymouth Volare Premier Edition. He had the kind of fancy one that had the nice plush seats and a few other little options. And, my 5-year-old self thought it was kind of a nice car, but my father said, that's actually the biggest piece of junk I've ever seen. He knew better. So you could get a Roadrunner package on a two-door Volare. I think the top engine was a 360 with most likely a 2-barrel. I think a 4-barrel was an option. They were all dressed up. This is one of those cars that was all show and no-go. Lots of stripes and graphics, spoilers, little louvers on the quarter window there. And yeah, as you can probably imagine, not a big seller, because why? People were not into this type of car. This is just a way for Plymouth to try to keep a legendary name alive, and when they really should have just let it die a quiet death instead of emasculating it like this. But okay, from a realistic standpoint, it's a handsome car. It looks good. It's just not very well built and not very fast, which, we kind of expect a performance car to be well built and a little quick, for crying out loud. All right, that's another Johnny Lightning casting. All right, let's take a look at a Greenlight casting. And I know especially you Gen Xers are going to recognize this, but maybe you never saw this version before. So when you were a kid growing up, you no doubt remember the old Checker Marathon taxi cabs. They were very popular used as taxi cabs because why? They had a lot of room in the back seat for passengers. They were very comfortable for the driver. They were durable. You could not kill these things. They had a lot of room in the trunk to haul lots of luggage from the airport or wherever it was you were doing. So, believe it or not, the Checker Motor Company, which I believe was based in Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, they made a couple civilian versions. And this is an example from 1972. You'll see this one, they dressed up with a vinyl top and one of those fake Landau bars. Remember these? They used to put these on the side of coaches. It was a way for one of the guards to grab onto the side of the coach and hold himself steady while they rode along, and he stood guard while the VIP who rode inside was in, safety. So Checker, this was just one of those weird little options they put on this. So usually there'd be a quarter window back here, if you remember that from the taxi versions. But the civilian versions were a little nicer inside, but they still had the old-fashioned, 1950s Checker styling. This car was introduced in 1959, and it stayed the same style all the way to 1982. They never altered it. The only way you can tell the year of a Checker Marathon is to look at the build plate on the inside of the door. Okay, now these could have everything from a Chevy 352 barrel to a Chevy 6-cylinder. They use a lot of components from GM. I think I remember them having a GM steering column and a GM lock cylinder as well. But like I said, they were a durable car. They were well suited for taxi service. It was just weird to see one used for civilian use because, let's be honest, they weren't particularly stylish. In fact, they were considered very outdated looking, especially by the 1970s. But they had a following. There were a very precious few people who actually bought a civilian version of a Checker Marathon. So that's kind of what makes this one an oddball. Not a bad looking car, and it's light brown with the black top. It's kind of cool. It's got a little brown interior, which is nice. Nice to see that instead of the, typical black. Very nice. So that's a little Greenlight casting. Okay, so moving along. We got a 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. What makes this weird? Well, a couple things. For one, the Toronado had a very unconventional speedometer. Instead of a ribbon with a needle that would go across like this, the Toronado had a drum speedometer. There was a fixed line on the instrument panel, and then the drum of the speedometer would rotate to indicate your speed. That was one interesting thing. The other thing was this car was, in 1966, was built with front-wheel drive and a large displacement V8 of 425 cubic inches. Now, I believe this was done on purpose, and here's why. In Europe, there was a long-held belief that if you combined front-wheel drive with an engine greater of 2 liters of displacement, the torque steer would be so tremendous the car would be rendered virtually uncontrollable under even normal driving. So Oldsmobile's division at GM, the division of Oldsmobile at GM, said to themselves, challenge accepted. Okay, and so they proceeded to put the biggest V8 they had at that time, which was, like I said, 425 cubic inches with a Rochester Quadjet 4-barrel carb, and combine it with front-wheel drive. And what they ended up with was a car that was very smooth, very capable, and even under full throttle input, the torque steer tug was very slight. It was quite a feat of engineering, and GM really patted themselves on the back for that. So that's what makes the Toronado kind of an oddball. It was also a very large car with pop-up headlights. That was an unusual thing to have on a large car with those pop-up headlights. A fastback roofline, also unusual for a large car, a large coupe like this. Very stylish. I remember Bill Mitchell was one of the designers at GM, and he had a lot of input in this car. And I remember reading an article where they brought this out after they had built the prototype onto the patio there to show off, and Bill Mitchell looked at it and he says, wow, the car didn't look this big when we did it in the studio. Yeah, it was quite a large coupe. And then its companion, the Eldorado, came out in '67, a year later, which with completely different styling. But yeah, Oldsmobile was always known as the innovation division, and that's why they were willing to try things like that. So yeah, the Toronado with its front-wheel drive, it had a torsion bar front suspension set up there, and the back was just a beam axle. But like I said, it ended up being a very smooth, very capable car, and also very stylish too. All right, what do we got left here? We got a pair of Matadors I'm going to show you. All right, so Matador, here's what happened. AMC Motors, they redesigned what was considered their full-size car lineup in 1967. The flossier version was called an Ambassador. It had a longer wheelbase. And then up until 1970, their more intermediate sized car was called a Rebel. Okay, they had a muscle car version called the Rebel Machine. And I don't have a version of that to show you in diecast, but I do have a printout to show you. That's what it looked like. Okay, and that one's done in their All-America version with the patriotic paint scheme, I should say. So this is what a Rebel Machine looked like. The regular Rebel was similar, but had a lot of styling cues that were much more muted down for just a regular coupe or sedan. So this particular one here is just a regular 1971 Garden Variety Matador. Not particularly weird, but like I said, there is one thing I'll show you that is weird with it, and that's with the package they came out with later on, and also something to do with the front end styling. So this one's relatively normal looking, as you can see. I wanted to show this one off because I wanted you to see the comparison. Okay, pretty clean design, fairly handsome car. This part here, the styling is a little awkward there in that sail panel, but other than that, overall it's a pretty handsome car. AMC had these nifty flush door handles, which was always kind of cool. And then this would have been kind of a very plain Jane version. You can probably tell, this would be the kind of car you'd see a cop car as, a taxi, something used in some municipal services in the government. All right, let me show you the oddball version. This was a 1-year-only car called a Matador Barcelona edition. Okay, so the Ambassador was killed off after the 1974 model year. So that means that the Matador became the biggest car, and it was, by 1970 standards, it was considered a intermediate. However, by 1978, when everybody was downsizing, this suddenly became known as a big car. So AMC decided to capitalize on that, and they created a special package called the Barcelona Edition. You could also get the Barcelona Edition on their fastback two-door coupe they had. So first of all, just the fact that they made a luxurious package on a relatively pedestrian car, that was kind of odd. Here's the other thing that's odd. So in 1974, they had to meet the bumper standards, right? Front and rear. So the rear, they basically had to flatten it out and just put this big girder on the back, which was not particularly attractive. The tail lamps were quite large and bold. Where it got weird was in the front. Okay, notice the car has this protruding nose. Bumper's the same way. Okay, why did they do this? Did they think that this looked good? No. This was an example of AMC Motors desperately digging through the couch cushions looking for loose change to develop their cars. Okay, they did not have the kind of development dollars that GM, Ford, and even Chrysler did. They were always the distant number 4 automaker. So here's what they had to do. They knew they had to spend money where the money counted, and that was on the absorber system for the front bumper, right? And then they could extend the hood out because that required minimal tooling change. However, they didn't have the money to tool up for new fenders. So what they did was they used the 1973 fenders that dated all the way back to actually 1967 on the front, had the headlamp set back, and then extended the nose to accommodate the bumper impact hardware and absorber system, and then extended the hood, which, like I said, required minimal tooling. And that's how they did it. And that's why the car ended up with this protruding nose. Okay. Now, I know it's a face that only a mother could love, but some people think that it's kind of quirky and weird in a fun way, which, you know, if that's how you feel, then more power to you, okay? Because you know what? From certain angles, guess what? It's a good-looking car, all right? Especially in this two-tone cream and gold paint scheme, which, by the way, was very popular in the 1970s. And then in the V8 engine family, these Matadors would have had everything from a 304 on the bottom. Then there was a 360, and then the 401 was the top engine. Now, I don't think the 401 was available in 1978 anymore. I think the top would be the 360. But that Rebel machine I just showed you, that would have definitely had a 401 with a 4-barrel in it. So there you go, diecast fans. There's some automotive oddities for you. I hope you learned something. That's one of the things I try to do with this. It's not just fun. You also get to learn some stuff with these cars, too. I always get a kick out of showing them to you. So in the meantime, take it easy. Enjoy yourselves. God bless. And we'll see you in the next video.